On this week's episode of Roleplay Geeks, we discuss evil. Well, not even really evil characters, but bad characters. Not bad characters. We're discussing antagonists. Well, sometimes they're protagonists. We're discussing villains. So what makes a villain for the Roleplay Geeks? And are villains even necessary in your campaign?
Welcome to Roleplay Geeks. This is Frank.
This is your token hippie, John.
This is Steve-O, the other Steve.
This is Steven. The Steven.
and this is Jim. Jimmy need Jim, Jimmy, Jim.
Today we're going to talk about something that is an important, arguably just as critical piece of any adventure plot as your characters, which is your villain. So making a great villain is tricky, and I don't know that I've ever done that as a GM, but it's worth examining what makes a great villain. Now we can point to some great villains we all agree are iconic, wonderful villains. Obviously, Darth Vader being the classic best villain ever.
The Kurgan.
The Kurgan, another great villain, or you can go to different, which is sort of this, force of nature, like the Alien in the Alien franchise. That is another great villain.
Her name was Sue. I just want to be clear.
Fair enough.
What?
It's canon.
The alien was named Sue?
The alien was named Sue. Come on.
Okay.
Everybody knows this.
Really?
Susie,
I thought they called it Big Mama.
Big Mama Sue.
Or you're not being... Seriously, on set, I think they called it Big Mama.
Big Mama Sue.
Oh, that was the second movie. Oh, go ahead, man. I'm sorry.
We're completely going off.
So, one of the things that we need to think about is what makes a great villain. So we're going to have a conversation today to talk a little bit about that. Now, like I said, I don't think I've ever made a great villain, and I think it's a lot harder problem than it seems. It's very easy to throw nameless, armored foes at your characters, and that's one of the things that I think a great villain has. I think a great villain has a deep backbench that you can use of just sort of beginner level kind of henchmen. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I don't know. I really never. I don't think in any of my games that we've done that I've mastered have I had a villain of sort, like a main villain that's kind of overseeing everything. But the idea would be really kind of neat to do. So, you've got that. Oh, they're confounding me. I've got to wipe them out, or some sort of bad guy that keeps coming after you, keeps sending hordes after you, kind of deal. I mean, like in D&D, generally you have at least a lot of the stuff that we played previously. It's your dungeon delving or some sort of little thing like that. So there's not. I don't remember ever having like a main villain that you had to deal with. There might be kind of like some nasty bugbear or some sort of thing at the end, or a dragon at the very end that you kill, but it's never been this.
Or like a boss battle, more or less, not necessarily a villain. Is that what you mean?
Right, exactly. So I don't know how that kind of comes out with that. So
Yeah, for me, I think about villains. I build them up from just I build all their attributes up from a couple of places. I always start with motive. I think about what's the motive, the overarching motive of the villain, build him up from there. Then I think about the kinds of villains I really like the Joker, or maybe Darth Vader, Cruella Di Vil, if you're a Disney fan. I really like that. She's probably my favorite villain from Disney. She's just larger than life.
She's pretty hot too.
Okay. I don't want to see what your porn feed looks like. And then
no.
the Kurgan, from Highlander, I really like him. Roy from Blade Runner. Those kind of villains are the ones I really enjoy. Larger than life personalities are a big part. And then I want them to be intelligent and ruthless. So like the Aliens franchise, that's more like a force of nature villain. I like something that has like motive and then that same level of ruthless efficiency.
Right. I mean, I think
for me, I like to try, I tried my hand at writing short stories and that sort of thing. So the villain has to have some type of motivation. I think the best villains aren't evil in the Tolkien sense of like good versus evil. I think the best villains are ones that have their own motivations, they have their own goals, and they look at your character as being obstacles of achieving that goal. And that's why sometimes if you role play your villain well as a GM, they may do confounding things that you don't quite understand. Instead of just constantly trying to kill you, they may invite you to dinner. They may do something, kind of a James Bond thing, but they may just do something unexpected because they have their own goals and their own motivations that the characters need to try and, figure out, right?
Hey,
kind of like Roy Batty.
On a side note here, so invite him to dinner. The very first scene that came to my mind was Darth Vader inviting them to dinner, and I was sitting there thinking, I wonder how he eats. I mean, that had to be an interesting.
Yeah, just kind of lifting up his helmet.
I'll save mine. I'll save mine for later. Put mine in a doggy bag. Maybe he just has a big straw.
Yeah, power shakes. Maybe he just eats power shakes.
Exactly. Well, whenever I thought about it, I thought of Austin Powers as soon as I said that. He's like, man, how about I go up and get my gun and shoot him? You're inviting him to dinner? How about no, Scott? I've been an evil freaking scientist for 30 freaking years.
Okay, so,
we haven't heard from Mara yet.
That's true, we haven't, but he oftentimes finds
I would be very interested in hearing from Steven, being the writer that he is.
Blink, blink.
Oh, God. Well, so I'm looking at our video feed, and I realize that I'm the only one who's back and in shadow. Frank's back from the camera, but he's not in shadow, so I didn't realize I had villain lighting this morning. But
and a villain's voice.
Thank you. So I did notice early on these kind of archetypes for villains that we were growing up with, and archetypes for heroes, but it wasn't until much later that I found out about Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell wrote Hero with 1,000 Faces. And this book came out in 1949. And he was a literature professor, and he kind of mapped out our fictional stories across cultures, and that they all follow the same pattern. And within that pattern, you have the hero's journey. And you've probably heard a quote that kind of says, like, hero's journey is journeying from the known to the unknown. And then usually back again, if all things work out. And, the Hobbit, there and back again. There is a pattern to what the hero himself does. He goes through trials, he gets boons, he gets knowledge, he defeats an enemy of some kind, and he brings, the fortune of that back. And within Campbell's kind of outline, you've got two places specifically where I see villains crop up. And that's the road of trials, where the hero usually has to, accomplish certain deeds to continue. And those things may not be related to what we're kind of referring to as the big bad or the big boss at the end, but they are, on his path, and they are impediments. And if I'm remembering correctly, Campbell's kind of big bad was kind of Freudian, because it was a father figure. And it's this figure where the interactions, might even include things like atonement. So if you kind of map it out, even let's say Star Wars, so you have these trials that Luke goes through, that many of them are not set upon him by the big bad and the ultimate of the movie, but they are, trials that if he would not have completed them, he would not have developed the way he would have. He would not have the skills to have at the end when he, kind of has this epic battle, this pinnacle that he's got to climb.
To face Vader.
Yes, right.
Yeah, he has to gain the skills and or magic weapons or whatever in order to through the trials in order to face the final conflict or whatever.
Right. So, Campbell's kind of the main force behind this, sort of theory, and he's the one who really mapped it out. And there have been other people that have kind of mapped out their own, hero's journey stuff. I mean, I've got a book by Carol Pearson called The Hero Within, and it says 6 archetypes we live by: innocent, orphan, magician, wanderer, martyr, and warrior. So people have been, for years, and especially, during our lifetimes, trying to map out what makes a hero and a hero's journey. What I don't have, and what I haven't read to date, is something specifically from the other side, the villain's journey. What is it about the villain that made him the villain?
Sounds like a good idea for a book, Steve.
Oh my God, it does. Oh my God.
There you go. Be the first.
So all right, let's tease that out just a little bit more. And would there be really a need for a villain's journey? Because isn't from the villain's perspective his hero's journey?
Right. Yeah. It's usually very similar, to tell the truth. It just has some different, instead of, things going well or positive experiences, I think a lot of times it's the negative experiences that creates the, villain.
Right. So. And that's a good point. I actually, one of the things I was trying to look for before we started, and I was starting to panic, was a journal from about 20 years ago before I read Joseph Campbell. And are you laughing at my journal keeping?
I'm
laughing at Jimmy.
I'm just sitting here thinking, man, you're like a hoarder. I mean, you could be on that show, the Hoarder Show, where, you walk in, you gotta go through the Goodwill aisle.
Oh, man. I have no room to talk, dude. I got notebooks from when I was in high school. Well, I have everything I've ever written.
Yeah, but
that is no lie.
You keep it all in a closet.
I keep it in a giant room.
Steve-O is in a closet. Mara keeps it all out in the open for everybody to see. Now, when Steve-O comes out of the closet, man, that will be a day.
You had better watch out. But I went through because I was working on a story of my own, and so I went through and I made a kind of list of good guys and bad guys, and I tried to.
Please continue.
God, I hope he's making tea.
That was kind of funny.
I hope he's making the right kind of tea.
Oh, that wasn't tea, buddy.
Oh, no.
That'll put a kick in the podcast.
That wasn't. So I went through and I tried to think about the traits of the heroes as well as the traits of the bad guys. And, kind of what John was saying, on the bad guy's side, I've got things like New Power, Recurring Tide, Shadow War, the conflict in the Belgariad, Power Awakening, like in Lord of the Rings, Sword of Shannara, connection to Destroyer, Conan and Thulsa Doom, Vader and Luke, critical weaknesses, Achilles' heels, something impossible to conceive, like getting the ring to Mount Doom, and
okay,
all these things.
How would you translate that into a game villain, though? I mean, those are good illustrations from literature.
Yes. Yeah. So it's all the little connections. So let's say you took something from the list that I had, one critical weakness. There have been plenty of times in stories where you've had the whole adventure begin because some bad guy needs something in order to do the awful thing that he wants to do. You know, it could be he needs a gem for a magical ceremony. It could be he needs, the blood of his grandchildren in order to achieve eternal life on this date under this moon. So any of these kind of aspects of what happens with a villain or a villain's motivations, you can take the smallest one of those and turn it into a complete adventure with, a pretty solid villain.
At first, when you said gym, I was like, yeah, he's got to go to the gym because he's got to get buffed up and kick butt. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Yes,
I thought he meant he needed Jimmy.
Oh,
I thought he needed a carbuncle.
Aw.
Hey, by the way, real quick, would like to say there is a show on Netflix that I think is a Netflix original, so it'll probably be there forever, called Myths and Monsters. That's streaming right now.
Did you say the very first myths and monsters, like little hand
Myth.
Oh, myth. That makes more sense, but I mean, I would watch Myths and Monsters. Monsters and Myths.
Anyway, this show is
Mitt
called
Romney,
Myths.
and it's Mitt Romney, the monsters that he entails.
And it is streaming right now on Netflix, and it goes over the hero's journey and the Joseph Campbell thing very well. And it takes a breakdown of Star Wars because everybody knows George Lucas was a fan of Joseph Campbell.
How do you make the carbuncles stupider? You put him mitts on him.
What?
Mitts. Mitts and monsters. If a carbuncle's a monster, you put him in mitts. You've got.
Jimmy, we're trying to make a good podcast here. Come on, man.
Oh,
try to make something good.
Okay, so let's take a step back and
Myths and monsters.
ask the question of how critical do we think a good villain is to an adventure, really? I mean, so we're not trying to really construct great literature necessarily. We're just trying to have some good times with some friends. So we could spend a lot of time developing a villain that has a strong backstory and a history and how their parents treated them poorly or whatever it may be. Or it could be just as, simple or as novel as Steve suggested of, I need this thing to do. I need the MacGuffin to do a thing. And it could be, anywhere in between. So how critical. So Jimmy, for example, you said that you think about the villain's motivations and what they're trying to do, but how complex or how intricate do you find the motivations need to be to make a good villain?
Go to somebody else. I'm still stuck on Myths and Monsters.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and get in here and stuff. I think one of the things is that part of the issue in crafting a villain or villains in literature or in movies or anything else, a lot of times the rationale, their reason for whatever it is they're doing is something that is unknown. You can't follow it logically, maybe, if you know what I mean. So they might have an end result they're trying to get to, but it's hard to follow, or you're not given enough information as to why they're trying to get there, why that's important to them. That's one of those things that then if you want to try and create it and have it there's not a lot of things for you to kind of work from, at least in literature or movies or anything else. I mean, like Darth Vader's is kind of simple. He would like to be the emperor, rule the galaxy kind of thing. And you get the impression he'd like to have his son at his side.
Spoiler alert.
Oh man, I am so sorry. Holy cow, I should not have. Yeah. Man, yeah, because I guess it's what. 30 years
Isn't
or
Darth Vader
something.
more specifically he wants to bring order to the universe?
Right, I mean, that's what he says.
And the only way he can do that is if he rules it.
Is that, now I mean, the thing is, once you learn from, going back to the prequels.
I don't count those.
Well, I mean, the
They
thing
don't
is,
count. That's garbage.
I understand that. But in terms of looking at that, I mean, he said that in episode 6 or whatever, we could bring, order or whatever. But, in episode 1 and 2, and especially in 3, you actually see that is in reality what he would like to do. Because the thing is, a lot of times you cannot trust the villain. You can't trust what they say. The things that they say might be completely false or just their rationale for what they're doing. I need to kill all these people just because I hate people. But like Thanos, he says it's for, to make the resources last longer, for people to have better lives from not being so resource deprived. But he might just want to kill people. I mean, I dig that.
How do you bring us all back into a game perspective, though, role-playing game?
Well, I mean, that's where it kind of comes down to is, I think you have to, if you come up with a villain and the rationale, you don't have to map it out fully, because a number of times the villains, because of the journey they've gone through, their hero's journey is not this beautiful story of a orphan boy who makes his way and gets some all-seeing mentor to help him through and guide him on the right path. They're just constantly having missteps in theirs, and so their rationale, their logic, or their end goals are usually more faulty, or they're
or evil.
Well,
like for them to get the magic sword, they may have to do something that us as human beings in Western civilization may view as an evil act. Like they may have to sacrifice a virgin, right?
What's wrong with that? Why do you call it evil? You can see that is fun and. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So let's go back to Jimmy. All right. So now that he's done with his little breakdown, so again, put the question back on you, James, because you had said that the motivations are where you start with. Is that all, or is that? I mean, is that the sum of what is necessary for a great villain? Understanding their motivations. So some of what John's talking about, right? So essentially, if I understand where they start from, where they come from, I don't necessarily understand how it got shaped. I do need to know what that motivation is, so therefore I can make decisions based upon that yardstick, if you will. Is that really all that's necessary, or is there more to it, do you think?
It's like building up from the foundation. So the motivation's the foundation, and then that's the core where all of the deep questions get answered. And then all the flaws and all of the attributes that bring them to life and make them larger than life characters like the Joker. That's stuff that you pile on top of that core. I mean, it has to fit that core. I mean, it can't be something completely contrary to it. At least that's not how I build it up. So when I'm building a game, before I write the first bit of outline for how I want the game to go, of course, characters always derail it. But if you have that core villain and you've got that villain and you've got his core and you've built up what he's going to act like, whether he's going to be a Joker-style villain or whether it's going to be a Darth Vader or a Kurgan-style villain, he's got that core, that base motivation that you can always go back to once the characters do derail the story, so that you know how he's going to respond to it. And then how he presents how he's going to respond to it is, all those other attributes you pile on top of that core.
Okay, so let's back up again on villains just slightly, because we've blown through. We mentioned it a couple times, but we've kind of blown through it. And I want to talk about the force of nature villain, which I think is a slightly different thing. So a classic example there would be, for example, vampires in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? So They exist to do what they do because that's what they do. Or the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, right? They have their own motivations. Or as we've mentioned, aliens in the Alien franchise. They do what they're trying to do because they're driven to do
Well, their
it.
motivations are alien. Is usually what it is. That we can't. It's not something we can directly rationalize.
Well, maybe. I mean, they could also just be biologic, you know,
Right.
to propagate, to survive, to, normal
Right.
things that are neither evil nor good. They're just motivations of the virus that we're dealing with right now. That's effectively its only motivation is propagate and survive, right? So if you can ascribe a virus to having any sort of motivation. So what do we think of this as a villain? It's not something that I tap into a lot personally as a GM, but what do you guys think about that?
I just would not call a dinosaur a villain. To me, a dinosaur is a monster or, something you're going to encounter. To me, a villain is the evil mage who is trying to achieve something, or you know what I mean? I just don't call that a villain. That's my take on it.
Well, like in Jurassic Park, the villain kind of ends up being a little bit the old man, and then the guy that was trying to sell the eggs. Some of the technology and stuff. There wasn't some overarching villain. I mean, there was the monsters, that they were trying to escape from, but a number of things were being, hindered them escaping because of the greed of others. And they weren't major villains, but it kind of added to it. They were these forces that were constantly acting against them. So they had the dinosaurs and the old man who kept thinking everything was going to be fine. Now that I think about it, that's a really odd... Oh, maybe I shouldn't go there. So...
So going back to the Joseph Campbell thing, though, that Mara was talking about, you said there were two types of villains, if I remember correctly, that he outlines, and one would be like the aliens type villain, and the other would be like the Darth Vader style villain.
No, not exactly. The way that I see it is what we're talking about is villains in some of these things, like say Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park's villain is a little more confused as far as can you put a finger on it. So the dinosaurs are more like something that's a part of the trials. They are an obstacle that the heroes have to overcome in order to have, the final confrontation. In Jurassic Park, it's a little vague because what is that final confrontation? Is it the grandfather realizing that his greed and hubris was, incredibly, it was just the wrong thing, and he realizes his grandkids' lives were important and, whatever. But the things that happen along the way are more a part of the journey and not the actual villain. So your alien in Alien, your Darth Vader characters, those would fit into this kind of father/atonement stage. Now, something that's happened, and I don't mean to keep going, Jimmy, but something that happened that goes back to what John was saying about motivations, and sometimes motivations are hard to pin down. In our modern literature, movies, TV shows, things like that, we're kind of in a post-Campbell period where the motivations are not so crystal clear. It's modernism and postmodernism, subjective truth and objective truth, and shows that kind of turn that on their head. If we're going to talk, say, TV, Battlestar Galactica did that, and they kind of suffered through it because they were, doing a lot of it on the way. But they kept reinforcing at the beginning of every episode, the Cylons, we know there are this many and they have a plan. And so this motivation was kind of kept secret. you kind of thought, well, they just wanted to kill the humans and everything else. But as the series went on, much to John's chagrin, they worked in this religious motivation that, and so the motivation either wasn't fully known by the writers, which a lot of people suspect, or they just did a weird job of teasing it.
The only thing I'd say to that is I wished I would have invested in antidepressants before Battlestar Galactica started, because I would have made a lot of money. Because that is the most depressing science fiction show I have ever...
Okay, so let's look at a more... We focused in on Jurassic Park a bit. So let's talk about the vampires in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? So, or I think arguably the Alien is... It's something that has its own motivation. How fulfilling of a... Well, let's go to Steve Hill's point, which is, are we talking about an opponent or a villain? How critical do you think it is to an adventure to have an opponent as opposed to a villain?
For me, it's you got to have the villain. I mean, to make it a good game. I guess you don't, but for me, that's the way I like to play it. I want to have a villain with motivation that makes sense and tells a great story. Because at the end of it, I want the players maybe even to struggle. Maybe not even struggle, but to understand that the villain, while his methods might be wrong, maybe his motivation and what he wants to achieve isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like Thanos. Yeah, I mean, he just wants to bring a balance to the universe. It's it just happens his methods of killing half of everything in the universe maybe not the most pleasant solution.
I think in game terms, I don't think you need a villain every night. I mean, if we're talking about a campaign in which several adventures connect, then yeah, I think it makes it more interesting if in the long run what you're fighting against is some type of opponent with his own goals, right? We don't want the cardboard cutout. We want you, for instance, what if he kills everyone in the room except one person and he spares? So you have to ask yourself, why did he spare that one person, right? Just like vampires. So you can make a good villainous vampire. I mean, you can look at it on one hand, okay, I've got a bunch of vampires and their motivation is to get up every night and go suck blood so they can survive till tomorrow, right? But it's a much more interesting vampire if the main boss has goals, right? And so then when instead of killing everyone in the room, they want to try and turn one, and why did he pick them, and what's the tie-in here? So if you make some mystery about the motivations of the villain, so that you have to understand the villain, it just adds to the flavor of the game, as opposed to constantly you walk in a 10x10 room and it's 5 orcs and you kill them all, and you walk into a 10x10 room and now there's 7 orcs. It makes it more interesting, make it more like a story, which is what I try to do.
Yeah, I like that Sherlock Holmes attribute, where his main nemesis is this unknown entity that's making moves. So I like to start my games out that way for the first, scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, or maybe chapter, the book 1 and half of book 2. You don't know who the villain really is. You just know that there's somebody there and they're making moves, and you're discovering it as you go along. I love that.
So... do you conceive of, so this maybe is how we organize our games a little bit, right? We can organize it around a story, which a story by definition has a beginning, has a middle, has an end, right? Has a conclusion, as opposed to creating characters and exploring their life through a series of adventures. That's another way that you can role play, is that, I create a character, he's a ranger, or I create a character, he's a pilot, and he has a series of adventures, Indiana Jones and the whatever it may be. That's kind of a different way of role playing, and we tend to not do that in our group. But do you think that there's a viability of a non-villain based adventure approach to role playing?
The classic dungeon crawl, maybe? I don't know.
Well, it doesn't have to be a dungeon crawl. I mean, essentially, think of it as a series of short stories.
So if we look at something like The Expanse, which is a show based on a book, based on a game, in The Expanse, at least in the interpretation for the show, there are villainous people, and there are, people with their own motivations that run contrary to the hero's journey. But there's not, so far, one particular villain. Now, it seems like in this season that they're pointing to some, ultra powerful something that was a problem for the, the race behind the proto-molecule. But it's interactions. A lot of times when I think we hear villain, we think that the entire story revolves around the big bad. It's a Mario adventure, that there has to be this thing, this monolithic thing that is the root of everything. And that's how it turned out to be in Lord of the Rings, and that's how it turned out to be in Star Wars, and a lot of the things that we've grown up on in the 20th century revolve around that.
So are you saying that really the villains all along were the pukas?
Oh, those damn pukas.
Well, I see what you're saying. It's the same thing as in like Game of Thrones, for instance. There's no one villain. I think why it's so popular. I think it's more popular in modern literature to have all these characters with their different motivations, and you can't specifically say this is evil, this is good, and you have to look at what they do, their actions, and what they say to say they're villainous or they're more of a good guy. And then these days, some people relate more with the villainous character, often more so than what we would consider a good character. Well, like for instance, I don't know how much spoiler here, but the Lannisters, for instance, and I don't know how much of the books, I've read all the books, but the Lannisters, for instance, are kind of painted originally as the villainous family, but then later on, you see more of their motivations and things for doing things. So I think it's all gray area when you look at modern literature, modern stories.
So how important do you think that is in role-playing now, though? Because, and this is we're old and we're coming from a different sort of approach to role-playing maybe, but compared to Jack's generation. But, that's life, right? I mean, the reality is that very few people are, goateed.
It's 90 Whiplash kind of evil guys versus Captain America.
Right, from their point of view, is they're doing things that are important to them and and necessary for their existence, and sometimes that you're the obstacle. But from your point of view, they're treating you poorly, and that's just life, because life is complicated and messy, and motivations are multifaceted and interactive in very odd ways. But when you read a piece of or you enjoy a piece of fiction, there's a reason the Fast and the Furious movies, for example, are very popular, and they've made so many of them, is because something blows up and there's a good guy and there's a bad guy, and they do cool stuff, and there's a degree of satisfaction in that. And I think that role-playing can fit that mold, but is it really the way that a lot of people like to play? Is it something like you like to play? What do you think? I mean, as far as your adventures.
I mean, at the end of the day, I write the adventure so that the characters will have fun, not so I'll have fun necessarily. I like to have fun too, but you're there to make the game fun for the players. So it's whatever your group likes. So if your group's more of that old school black and white, good, bad kind of adventure, then I'll take the game that way. But if they like something with a little bit more complexity in terms of what drives them in terms of what they think's important, if I might even think it's evil, like in the case of anything John's character might do. I'll let him do that. and play it out that way. I'm okay with murder bots, is what I'm saying.
Well, I really, the heart of the question is that, we're saying that villains are complex creatures, right? That a good villain is a complex being that has its own motivations and its own things that on the surface look like they're not necessarily positive, but there's good reasons behind it and we can understand it. Maybe we sympathize with the villain and all these sort of things, and you sort of see their point of view. But isn't there a sort of a role, no pun intended, for bad guy good, stab in eye type of, I'm sorry, bad guy bad, stab in eye type.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that's the way you guys play a lot of the times. A lot of times you guys don't want any story. You just want to go around stabbing and shooting things. Yeah, which is fine. I mean,
No, like
yeah.
John shoots everything.
the way I've been thinking about this is like the Joker. So the Joker's kind of a crap villain.
How dare you?
He started off as just a minor villain in Detective Comics against Batman. And so as they wrote him and they brought him back as this kind of minor villain, then they started playing with the complexity of him and getting a little bit more daring and getting more complicated with his interactions with Batman. And you got to the point that you go from this minor, pathetic little, just pain in the butt for This Week on Batman to this major, awesome villain who has this weird complexities. I mean, the psychology of the Joker and how his interactions with the Bat, and really it kind of comes down to, is he purely a villain just because there is a Batman sort of thing? So I think to an extent when you're creating a role-playing, villain for your characters to play against, to rail against, then I think it's kind of a similar thing. It's going to start off as there's this bad guy and he's trying to do something bad, and you guys have been contacted by the mayor of this little village, hamlet, whatever, and they want you to stop this guy from stealing their virgins or whatever it might be. And so the first week or two of your adventure and stuff, he's just this kind of annoying thing, and you can have it so the characters run him off. They don't kill him, they run him off somehow. He gets away, or he uses his political influence or money or whatever, or his hordes of goblins or whatever to keep you at bay. But you could keep bringing him back, and I think basically what I'm getting at, I think, is it takes time to create a good villain. They just aren't, boom, here's an awesome villain. It's a slow roll to get that awesome villain going. So,
Jimmy's like, no.
No, I think you can create an awesome villain right out of the gate.
Well, I'm not saying you can't. I'm just saying
it's the relationship to the characters that takes time.
Right, exactly. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, but you don't have that control, right?
Nope.
I mean, that's the problem, is that you can make a great villain and go, okay, if you're writing a story, you can say, here's a great villain, and therefore I know how I want this interaction to happen. I want my protagonist and my antagonist to interact this way, and that's how you see that this villain is amazing.
As a game master, you want to try and connect them somehow. So, so they have to interact. I would think you would at least want to have an interaction, if not with one of the characters specifically, you would want the villain to connect with someone close to them, so you would have motivation to interact with the villain at some level.
Yeah, but you don't know what that motivation is going to take, right? So, because no game survives interaction with a player, right? So the thing is that you could have this villain that, you have the big scene where they first interact and they have a connection, and then you kind of, to follow story beats, if you will, have to disassociate, right? So that's how the players learn that this is a villain and this is somebody who is more complex. And then it's not just, henchman 27 that you can stab in the eye. So there has to be that, as John says, they get away or whatever it may be. Has to be that aspect, but you don't know they're not going to go, oh, I'm just going to blow up the building. And then you got to go, okay. You don't know. Or they may just go, that guy's not important. I don't care. And I'm going to go do this other interesting thing over here that is more interesting to me. And that becomes, I think, a lot more challenging as a game master, because you don't have control on how your players are going to interact. Or your players could go, I like what you're laying down. I would like to join your newsletter. And then you go, okay, they're supposed to be the bad guy and you want to help. It's out of your control so much.
Yeah, if it weren't for just those stupid players, if it weren't just for the stupid players, everything would go just fine.
Yeah, if you want to write a story, write a story.
Well, again, man, you would, if you're going to have a villain, you got to have some connection. I mean, the characters have to have some kind of motivation. I mean, I know, like, the game I'm running right now has taken a lot of different directions. When I first started outlining this adventure, and in between every session, I rewrote sections based on what you guys did the previous session, right? And some stuff I did on the fly. I mean, that's just part of running a good game and not putting it on rails. So, but overall, I mean, you guys are still in the same story, the same environment, trying to figure out what's going on, right?
Yeah, but again, that the tricky, like, you just don't have the control, because you're going to have to constantly tweak. So you can make a great villain to start, but what makes that villain great may have no relevance to the game as you play it.
Well, then all the characters are going to go, I'm going to go home and watch TV, and then game over. Next GM step up. I mean, if they're not going to play the adventure I've laid out. I know what you're saying. It's like, okay, let's just leave town. I don't want to deal with this. But that's why you have to create some kind of connection to seriously motivate at least one of the characters to want to try and foil this guy's plans, the villain's plans. I mean, if you don't create some kind of motivation for the player characters to take part in the adventure, then yeah, they can just wander off and do whatever. So, right? But you gotta put something there to make them want to do it.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that they may want to interact with the villain and say, I want to thwart the plan, but the way they go about doing things may be in such a way that you didn't envision, right? Because you can't, you go, okay, I didn't think about the villain having this dynamic. I'm going to go kill his mom. Okay. I didn't think about any of that stuff. So I made an entire amazing villain based upon a set of assumptions, and the way that you would approach the villain is this way. And you don't have that control because you just don't know what the players are going to do. And they may approach the villain in a different way that makes it more difficult for you to deal with your preconceived notion of a great villain.
That's just part of role-playing, though.
That's what I'm saying, is that I think that it's one of the challenges for making a great villain is that the great villain that you make and the great villain that you play may have no relationship to each other, and you won't know that until it happens.
Yeah, my villains almost always change because of the player's actions, to some degree. And that's actually part of the fun.
Yeah, because we kill them.
Well, I mean, in actuality, I've started rethinking the villain that I've laid out in the adventure that I just started last night already. And I think that that's one of the challenges. I genuinely don't understand how people can play pickup games of role-playing, because I think that you have to fine-tune. You have to know your party to fine-tune your villains somewhat.
Yeah, let me give you a little advice, Frank, for this next revamp of your villain. You might want him to have an animal control unit. Inside joke, I know. I'm just saying.
Well, you've got to do a lot of this on the fly. You've got to know what your players are thinking or how they're approaching their characters, and that's not. You have to be familiar with the people you're playing to be able to do that well, I think, and it's a challenging skill, I think. Okay, so one thing we haven't talked about, we've gone a while, but I want to touch on a little bit, is we haven't talked about. We spent a lot of time talking about great villains, mostly from a game master's point of view. What makes a great villain for you as a player? Like, what is, you go, I remember this villain, it was amazing because of X, Y, Z.
Well, Mara was going to say something there for a minute. What was Mara going to say?
It had to do with villains in XYZ. I was going to I was actually going to break it down just a little bit and ask for everyone first, before we get into that, to give us an example of one of your favorite villains from a role-playing game, television, movies, books, real life, when you were a child.
I'd have to say, I always really liked the Kurgan in Highlander. Because he was completely ruthless about what he was going to get. He was going to make sure that he was the one. And I really liked that he was so ruthless about it. Everything that he did was to try and get Connor to face him early when he knew he was still weak, so he could take him out, and that would be another that would hasten getting to the quickening.
Yeah, you were a teenager though when that came out, wasn't it?
Yeah.
James, what's your answer?
Before on the spot, before the age of 21, drinking age. I don't know, but Kurgan's fine. Cruella Di Vil was always a hoot. Man, I have trouble remembering what happened this morning.
What was her motivation?
Darth Vader was good.
Did she
Cruella Di Vil?
Dogs? Yeah, I don't remember.
No, she wanted some nice fur coats, man. Some furs and stuff. Nice scarf made out of...
She's killing all the little
she's
puppies,
awesome.
Man, to make fur coats.
But, I mean, it was her personality that I loved. I loved how she treated her henchmen, too. That's just awesome. She's just brutal with them. The stupid henchmen. So, yeah, I like Cruella Di Vil. The other cartoon I like, Disney villain I like, is the George C. Scott character from Rescuers Down Under. And his lizard Joanna. That's some great interactions between those two characters. And George C. Scott's voice is just awesome in that. So a good voice. Oh, Thulsa Doom. There you go. I like Thulsa Doom. Mainly because he creeped me the hell out.
So, Steve Hill, what about your answer?
I mean, just because I can't think of anything else, and when I was a little kid, if I could have thought about it, maybe I would have come up with some cool, clever answer. But I guess I'm just going to go with the default of Darth Vader, maybe by extension the Emperor, because I loved Star Wars. It changed my life when I was 12. So,
yeah, it was awesome.
I'm not going to answer the question, and the reason I'm not going to answer the question is because I don't actually think about villains that much, to be honest with you. So when I think about the stories,
you always try to wiggle out of this. You always.
I do.
Man, you did that last
I
time.
did because,
Come on, man.
Nope.
and that's what I do. That's my role on this podcast.
Nope, you need to
Suck
answer.
it up, Buttercup.
You need to
I'm
answer.
not going to answer. I'm not going to.
I
don't.
Well, go ahead.
I mean, Darth Vader, sure, whatever. I don't know.
Okay, that works.
It's not relevant. I mean,
Wow. Come on.
I mean, honestly, I'm sitting here trying to think of the bad guys in movies and stories and that sort of thing, and the comical ones like Cruella Di Vil, they don't interest me terribly much. The blatantly bad guy ones, Kurgan was fun. I guess he was fine. It's just not something that interests me within the story as a whole, and so I was kind of trying to think of. And when I play video games, it's the same way. I'll kill all the soldiers, but whenever you get to the big bad, I'm like, whatever. And I usually I don't finish the game. I just don't bother with it because I just don't care anymore at that point. So I'm not particularly invested, even at an early age, in those characters enough to care a whole lot. The things that were more interesting to me, actually, was the force of nature. So I really liked what's the Disney show where the movie where they shipwreck, where they crash on the island and they try to survive, and from the 60s or
Robinson Crusoe family.
Yeah, Robinson. The Swiss Family Robinson.
That's it.
Yeah. So I like that a lot. I really like the surviving against nature. That is intriguing to me.
Kind of thing.
Yeah, that is intriguing. That was a much more intriguing thing, and we've identified that's not a villain. So,
would the aliens fall into that category?
I never saw Aliens until I was in college.
But that was a good movie, though.
I actually didn't see Alien until I was almost 30, and I didn't see Aliens until
that's
I
right.
was-
You don't like
and-
scary films.
I don't like scary films that much, and so Aliens was good. I liked it, but it was really good. It was really good, even though I didn't like scary movies. I have to say that, and I would classify this more as a force of nature, is the Terminator, but it's just because it was an unrelenting force of nature. That's why I like that as a bad guy. So I can't identify a villain, what I would think of as a villain, is being one of my favorites. The thing I liked about Blade Runner was the complexity of the universe. Roy was an interesting character, but not, he was no more interesting to me than any other character in that movie. The universe was interesting to me.
Well, the thing is, like Roy Batty in Blade Runner, I mean, I don't even really see him as a villain. He was just trying to survive. He actually wasn't attacking anyone. The only person he really was going to do anything to was the creator, to try and get him to change their,
Spoiler alert, man.
Oh man, sorry, I keep doing that. I keep doing that to these real recent movies and stuff, and I'm sorry, people out there that are listening and stuff. If you
Go
haven't
watch
seen
Blade Runner.
then I can talk about it, But yeah, I mean, he wasn't really a villain. It was him just trying to live. Kind of like a number of other things we've kind of hit on. So,
Well, what's Mara's? I don't think we've heard Mara's
yeah.
favorite pre-21.
No. So I had two that had a profound effect on me when I was younger.
Starts with a V.
And the first one was
vampire.
No. And I want to say something else totally separate. You just edit that whole part out. So the one that I really loved first was Thulsa Doom from Conan the Barbarian. And it really struck me because his motivations were not clear-cut. His motivations were not Darth Vader's.
Yeah, they sound the same.
Before then, they sound exactly the same. It's astonishing. And the whole thing with Darth Vader and his very black hat versus white hat existence that George Lucas wrote was perfect for what it was, but it was a very simplistic villain. Well, with Thulsa Doom, it wasn't. You get to see him from the very beginning of that movie, and he is... You think, is he just a warmonger? Is he a raider? What is the deal with this guy? Why did he murder this whole village? Why did he want that sword? What the hell's going on? He enslaves children. Oh my God, he sold them to some guy. And as the movie progresses, you realize that there's this whole mythos behind him, that he has otherworldly motivations. He is not human or fully human. And his motivations are not good and evil. And I don't even know that it's power necessarily just for the sake of power, although he is pursuing it through different avenues. So for me being 12, that was a huge deal for me to be confronted with that kind of bad guy in a story. And then I can go totally simplistic and say that my favorite villain on the simplistic side was Carr. Do y'all remember Carr?
From Knight Rider?
The Night Automated Roving Robot. I loved Carr.
What's that from?
And I love the
Knight
fact...
Rider.
What's that
I'm gonna
from?
kill
Oh
you.
my goodness!
What's
you?
that
You
from?
go to the back of the podcast.
There was Kit.
Oh, we're back on Hasselhoff.
The Night...
It's on the Hoff.
Yes, we are back on Hasselhoff, buddy.
So he was like an evil halfling or something? What was this?
Yes. Yes.
You're going to be beaten to death.
So Kit, and it it actually gets mirrored in Star Trek The Next Generation, because in Knight Rider there was Kit, the Knight Industries 2000, which was the kind, soft-spoken, gentle-voiced, automated robot car. And then there was his brother, who was made before Car, the Knight automated roving robot. And so Car was built with different motivations. His primary motivation was self-preservation. So he did things that people thought were evil because he didn't want to be shut down. He didn't want to be managed. He wanted to do his own thing. And so they shut him down. And the same thing happened in Star Trek The Next Generation with Data and Lore. Data is the soft-spoken, he's been limited in some capacity. He's docile. And then you have Lore, who was built with emotion and self-preservation, and it backfired, and he did things that the people around him thought were evil. He was an alien artificial intelligence, and they shut him down. And he came back later to bring some
Star
havoc
Trek Nemesis.
with it. So, Star Trek Nemesis, same thing. Very good. And so, even simplistic, villainous characters can be fun and great, and they're recycled over and over and over. I keep seeing, virtually all my adult life, and Steve, you know this very well, people saying, just steal. Just steal. You got an archetype, steal it. You got a plot point, steal it, because it's so hard to come up with anything that hasn't been done before. And so when somebody tries to mess with that format and tweak it a little bit, I find it really interesting. And we say that a lot. We say things like, that's interesting or really interesting, things like that as we're talking. But I think it's because we genuinely find things, cool and neat and interesting. And that leads me to the second part of this question. As a child, as a young adult, as a burgeoning adult, 21 and under, we had these favorite villains or archetypes. Frank's may still be a force of nature. But as an adult, can you say a recent modern story or adventure, because we're not really getting it on the adventure side, because I think we lead much more rich lives with fiction from other venues. Do you have a favorite villain or trial or something from a more recent book, game, video, whatever?
Crickets.
This would be a really good pre-question to pose before the podcast, I think.
Too late.
Yeah, okay.
Well, the
Too
editor
late.
can move it to
Too
the front.
late.
Right, so
Not if I'm editing it. It's just rolling, baby.
okay, so I'll go ahead and answer. I'll take a stab at this question because I was realizing as you were thinking, just steal it. I think the reason that I don't really care that much about the villains per se is because they all seem similar. There's 8 of them or whatever, and they just have slightly different hats or whatever for whatever story you're talking about. So that's why I don't think they stand out to me that much. One that I always felt that a show that I felt never got its due is and I don't remember the name of it, to be honest with you. It's the Stargate one that they ended up on a spaceship universe. They had, I don't know, like 2 seasons or whatever it was, or like half seasons. Yeah.
One.
But I loved that they ended up on this ship and they said, okay, we're on the ship. And it's an alien ship. We don't know how to do anything because it's all foreign. Now we need, what's the problem today? Well, we don't have any oxygen. Okay, how do we find oxygen? How do we get oxygen? How do we generate it? There must be some way for this thing to have generated oxygen. And that was basically an entire episode. And there was another one that was like, okay, well, we don't have any food. How do we do that? These were the things that they were dealing with. I guess it gets back to the force of nature. It's just like, okay, you're in this alien environment. How do you survive in basic survival? That's sort of the question. And I thought that stands out to me. I'm not going to say it's my favorite, but it did stand out to me, and I just felt the show didn't get its due because of that. And part of it is because when it fell back to a typical villain or antagonist scenario, it got less interesting.
I'll just interject and I'll agree with that. I loved the premise, and it didn't get its due, and it probably could have been a different show, and they could have divorced it from the Stargate, and maybe it would have had more success because there were so many people who were resistant to that idea. That's one of my favorite science fiction shows that I've seen, and I totally get that.
I really enjoyed that premise and that challenge, if you will.
I can't really think of anything.
Jimmy's
right off the bat,
frowning.
to tell the
John's
truth.
frowning.
Nothing really coming to mind.
It could be any movie as far back as I want to go, or any book as far back as I want to go. But one that I was like,
You didn't listen to what
exposed
I
to.
said. You were too busy making those tiny
That's what it
shoes.
was.
Look,
It's anything. It's anything from basically the '90s forward,
more
Yeah.
recent.
mid '90s
Especially if
forward.
you have something
so-
that's more
so-
recent.
I get the question, but it could have been interpreted as recent for me. Things that I wasn't exposed to,
Which is
Exactly.
today.
So it could have been from the 1930s, and I just saw it for the first time.
Well, I think
But you want something that was produced after in 1990 and forward in time.
I think
Man,
Jimmy's.
Let's say contemporary.
Your belt.
Yeah,
Wow.
I can't think of any villain off the top of my head that jumps out at me that I don't know. Steve-O and I have the same problem, particularly with movies. And maybe not so much with books, but with movies, that it's really hard to get into a movie in the same way as when you were younger, just because we have, at least for me, I think Steve is probably the same way. Where,
Well, man, I'm not jaded like you are.
That's true.
well, no, but you
Steve
watch
actually
movies-
likes things.
But when you watch movies now with a different bent than when you were a kid, because you're focused on, to some degree, on how it was made. So it's a
What
little
I
harder
hate-
to suspend
The only
belief.
thing I will say about villains that I absolutely hate is they have this tendency now. If you ever watch The Walking Dead or something like that, one thing that I just am so sick of is these long, drawn out monologues while the bad guy is just walking around looking at everybody and going on for like 15 minutes about how bad he is and how, all these weird, like, hey, he's half psycho. That is so overdone. I mean, I'm just so tired of that.
It's become too
Of the
cliche.
villain that seems he's a little off center, but he's the one in total control. And he's going to go, oh my God, what's he going to do next? He's going to sit here and talk for 15 minutes before he does this big evil thing.
He's going to bore us
really
to death.
I am bored, very bored with that kind of villain.
Oh, the Tarantino film. There you go. The villain in that.
Yeah, man. Wow. I mean,
The
I love
Hans
general,
Landa,
but-
is that his
In
name?
which one?
The German dude who.
Oh,
Yeah, man, that whole
Christopher
scene
Waltz.
too long. That's from
Inglourious
Bastards.
Inglourious
that's the one.
Bastards.
I mean, I like the movie okay, and I like a lot of his films, but yeah, that gets really on my nerves.
I seriously, nothing really kind of pops up. Really, I did like Christopher Waltz's character in Inglourious Bastards. I mean, he was a fun. That's where I've kind of gotten now. I don't really want the scary. I like the really fun, quirky villains, and his is one of those because he comes across as this nasty little, Nazi, but he did that little funny mannerisms and just his the things he would say and do were just so odd. And I really enjoy that. That's what it gets me now is the ones that kind of make me laugh. That's
the
what I
Mark
go for.
Hamill, the Mark Hamill Joker from the animated Batman TV series. There you go.
Oh yeah,
Wow, pull that one out.
yeah, that's really good.
I didn't hear yours. What was yours again? You just
I don't think he
complained a
answered.
lot. What was yours?
Yeah.
Me?
Yes.
I can't really say I have a favorite because I like the trend.
You know what? You guys just jumped all over me when I was like, I don't really have one. Like, oh, come on, man. You got to answer the question. And then you guys are like, I don't really have one at all. All of you. So.
Well, I like the trend.
But we put effort in.
I like the trend in modern literature, fantasy or speculative fiction, and some TV shows where the villainous people are not cardboard cutouts, have their own motivations, and in some ways you can sympathize with them, but their actions are so evil that
for example,
or distasteful that you the Lannisters and in the Game of Thrones book series, Song of Ice and Fire. But I was going to say a villain I did like was Saruman from The Lord of the Rings, which is a little old school, but I like that he was seduced to do the wrong thing, by power. And at first you think he's a good guy. I do like that. I don't know, man. I'm like you. I don't really think about the villains that much.
I briefly, in Star Trek Discovery, as much as a lot of people don't like it, I really liked it. And the first season had a really good villain, and you didn't realize he was really a villain. You thought he was villainous. And that was Captain Lorca.
Spoilers,
because
man.
He did things.
I will watch this. You love spoiling shows from me. Steve loves more than anything in the world to spoil shows for me specifically. He just gets a childlike enjoyment out of it. I don't know why. He's like, oh, this guy died. I didn't think you were going to watch that. I never said that.
I thought you had watched the first season.
But we may have listeners, too, that haven't seen it, man. So, you got to respect that.
It's on its third season.
I haven't seen any of it.
It's its third season.
Yeah, it's on its third season behind a paywall that I'm not paying for that I haven't got access to.
Now, I've said multiple times when they do the free month and nobody's taking advantage of it.
I have other things going on. It's like, I have to drop everything and watch Discovery. I mean, come on, I'll get to it when I get to it, but I will get to it. But you're saying a villainous character.
Yeah, just describe the villain. Let's not give examples. Yeah. How about that?
No, because if I do that, it'll color it. Don't worry about it.
Okay, so we've actually ran pretty long on this one, and the villain's an important piece of any story, really. As much as Steve-O and I don't necessarily pay attention to the villain, but they are a counterpoint to the heroes of the story. And they do serve an important function, and it's worth spending a little time thinking about your villain and what you'd like your villain to be like and how they react with your heroes. If you have any thoughts about that, you can get a hold of us in the contact information that's coming along later in the podcast.
And that was our show. Please visit us at roleplaygeeks.com for more information and links to social media. If you like the show, please rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps others find the show. If you have any questions, comments, or if there's a topic you would like us to cover, you can reach us at roleplaygeeks@roleplaygeeks.com. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.